This is Audible.
Brilliance Audio presents The Good Lie by A.R. Torre, performed by Susan Dallion. Dedicated to Eva, I love you. Chapter 1. The prestigious street still held secrets of the horror. The missing person flyers were tacked into the Canary Island palms, their colors faded from the elements, the edges of them curled from rain and wind. The white brick mansion at the end of the street no longer had police cars parked in its circular drive. The press vans and cameras had slowly moved on to other stories. The iron gates, which had been necessary to keep the well-intentioned public at bay, were deserted. The weight of silence hung in the sunny Los Angeles air. Scott Harden stumbled down the palm tree-lined sidewalk and toward the large gates. As he moved, the White House swayed before him, the view blurred by sweat burning the corners of his eyes. His monogrammed polo shirt, stained from weeks of wear, stuck to his back. Bruises and cuts from the stiff rope circled both wrists, and he quickened his steps, moving into a jog as he grew closer to the home. As blood oozed from the incision on his chest, he staggered to a stop at the gate's security panel. He pressed the code into the keypad, leaving bloody fingerprints behind. The gates chimed and hummed as they slid open. Nita Harden stood before the bathroom mirror and tried to find the energy and motivation to pick up her toothbrush. Her counter, once clustered with perfumes and expensive cosmetics, was empty. Her blonde locks, which had always been kept up with bi-weekly visits to the salon, now had a half-inch of dark gray roots. Wearing a black yoga suit that hung from her frame, she looked nothing like the put-together socialite who had clawed her way to the top echelon of Beverly Hills society. Did bad breath matter when your son was missing? Did anything when each day was just a horrible waiting game for someone to discover his body? The Bloody Heart Killer was reliable. He kidnapped handsome and popular teenage boys like her Scott. He held each boy prisoner for a month or two, strangled them and mutilated their bodies, then discarded them like bags of trash. There had been 6 boys before Scott, 6 naked bodies found, a heart carved into their chests. It had been almost 7 weeks since Scott had disappeared. Any day, his body would show up, and she would be called to the morgue to identify her son. The tones of their security system chimed, and she looked up from her toothbrush, listening as it played one of the custom sounds of the front gates. When they built the home, each of them had picked a unique gate code and notification sound. Every time she pulled her Jaguar up to the gates and used her remote or personal code, the gentle tinkling of bells would sound. Her husband's was the UCLA fight song. Scott's was a simple trill. Her toothbrush clattered into the sink as Scott's personal chimes sounded through the large bathroom. A fresh pang of raw emotion ripped through her heart, and she let out a painful cry at the familiar ring, one she had taken for granted for years, one that instantly brought to mind Scott's big grin. He always came bounding in with his backpack slung over one shoulder, beelining for something to eat. She moved to the large window at the end of the bathroom and peered down at the front yard, expecting to see one of his friends' cars or the van of their cleaning crew or landscapers, any of whom Scott might have given his code to. No vehicle appeared through the foliage, and she cupped her hand to the glass and tried to see down to the entrance gates. A figure moved stiffly down the center of their crushed shell drive, one leg dragging a bit and drawing a long line behind him. Her breath caught painfully in her throat at the familiar gray polo, identical to the dozens that still hung in Scott's closet. His face wasn't visible, his attention forward, but she knew that build instantly. Whirling, she tripped over a copper-clawed foot of the tub and fell to her knee. Hiccuping out a sob of emotion and pain, she bolted to her feet and through the arched opening that led to their bedroom. Barreling into the hall, she knocked past a maid as she rounded the staircase and sprinted down the stairs, her hand tight on the banister, her vision blurring with tears. "George!" she screamed, her head whipping in the direction of her husband's study, where he often worked from home. "George!" Without pausing to see if he was home or had heard, she yanked at the heavy bronze handle of the front door and swung it open far enough to squeeze out. Her bare feet churned against the crushed shelves, the pain ignored as she tore down the middle of the drive, screaming out her son's name. Scott's head lifted, and he staggered to a stop, his features exhausted as his mouth wobbled into a smile. He slowly lifted his arms, and she crashed into them. Her son, against all odds, was home. Chapter 2. I listened to John Abbott's voicemail and wondered if this was the day he would kill his wife. "Dr. Moore," he rasped, his voice uneven and emotional. "Call me back. She's gonna leave me for him, I know it. This is it." John, who always arrived 5 minutes early for our appointments, in pressed clothes and meticulous shape, who wrote my checks in painfully neat block writing, sounded as if he was falling apart. I listened to the end of his voicemail, then pressed the screen and played it again. Sighing, I returned his call. I had determined over a year of one-on-one psychiatry sessions that John suffered from pathological jealousy. We had spent the first 2 months focused on his wife and her supposed infatuation with the landscaper. John was resistant to behavioral therapy and staunchly opposed to the thought of taking phenothiazines. After weeks of urging, he took my advice and fired the landscaper, which resolved the situation. He had now found a new source of worry, their neighbor. His suspicions seemed to be unfounded, which wouldn't be too alarming if he didn't also suffer from a growing compulsion to kill said wife. As I waited for him to answer, I opened up the fridge and pulled out a gallon of milk. Whether John Abbott had the capacity to kill was up for debate. Still, the fact that he had consistently considered it for almost a year was validation enough. He didn't answer, and I ended the call and set my phone on the counter. I poured a tall glass, then moved aside the stiff lace curtains and peered through the window above the sink. Through a fine layer of pollen, I saw my cat knead her claws along the polished red finish of my convertible's front hood. Knocking at the glass, I tried to get her attention. "Hey!" Clementine ignored me. I downed the milk in one long gulp and tapped the window harder. No reaction. Rinsing out the glass, I stacked it in the top shelf of my dishwasher and eyed my cell phone. This was the first time John Abbott had called my cell. Unlike Rick Beacon, who couldn't book a tea time without getting my approval, John was the sort of client who viewed a call for help as being weak and incapable. For him to leave a voicemail on a Tuesday morning was significant. Had he caught Brooke? Or had his paranoia and jealousy hit a breaking point? "She's gonna leave me for him. I know it. This is it." Loss, for a man like John, could be a world-breaking concept, especially since he had a singular focus on and distorted view of his wife. That focus had grown into an obsession, one with a violent thread that hovered toward maniacal. I called him again, my concern mounting as the phone rang and rang with no response. The possibilities appeared, unwelcome in my mind. The pharmacist with the perfect handwriting and 2 missed appointments this month standing over his wife, a bloody knife in hand. No, I corrected myself. Not a knife. Not with Brooke. It would be something else. Something less hands-on. Poison. That had been his recent fantasy of choice. I checked the clock on the microwave. Over 2 hours since he had called me. Anything could have happened in 2 hours. That's what I got for sleeping in. The Ambien, which had seemed like a great idea at 3 a.m., had cost me this missed call. One more call, I told myself. I'd wait a little bit, then try him once more, and then move on with my day. Obsession, as I frequently told my clients, never affected outside situations. They only made your internal struggles and resulting personal actions and decisions worse. I fixed a piece of toast and ate it, chewing slowly and deliberately as I sat at my dining room table and watched an episode of Seinfeld on my cell phone. After I'd wiped down the counters, rebagged the bread, and washed my hands at the sink, I tried him again. And just like the first 2 times, he ignored my call. At 9:45, as I headed to the office for my first appointment, John Abbott failed to show up for his shift at Breyer's Pharmacy. There was immediate concern. The man was a tyrant about punctuality, so much so that 2 junior pharmacists had quit in tears after being subjected to his long and almost violent rants on time accountability. After his tardiness stretched to 10:30, then 11 o'clock, and repeated calls to his cell phone went unanswered, the 3 staff members convened at the back of the medical racks over what to do. The line of customers, which had never extended past the adult diaper section of the aisle, now stretched all the way into herbal remedies. At the front, a man with a bushy white mustache and cowboy hat cleared his throat. A decision was made to find John's wife on Facebook and send her a message. With that task complete, they waited another 15 minutes, then dispatched the most junior and expendable member of the team to drive to his home. Joel Blanker was 21 years old and a pharmacy intern from Little Rock, Arkansas. He liked Dungeons and Dragons, Latin women, and chicken tenders with extra ketchup. As I listened to Phil Ankerley mull over a documentary he'd watched on Ted Bundy, Joel parked on the street and texted the assistant pharmacist to let him know that John's car was there, parked in the drive, behind a white sedan. The instructions Joel received were simple. Ring the doorbell. Ask John if he's coming to work. Duck and cover if he starts to yell. Joel began at the 1-story home's front door, his armpits damp from the Los Angeles heat as he listened to the chime echo through the house. After a second ring, and with no sounds from inside the home, he moved around to the carport. Knocking gently on the side door, he waited, then, hesitantly, cupped his hands to the glass and peered in. At the sight of the blood and the body, he stumbled back, his dress shoe catching on the carport's curb. His cell phone skittered across the ground and came to a stop against a support pillar. He crawled across the cleanly swept surface and picked up the phone. Ignoring the fresh spiderweb of cracks across its display, he unlocked the device and jabbed the digits for 911. After my second morning appointment, I swung by the 45th Avenue gym. My concerns over John Abbott's voicemail faded as I changed into gym clothes and climbed onto a treadmill. I dialed up the speed and scanned the row of television screens, zeroing in on one that showed a newscaster's face, the words, "BH Killer" in bold font under her chin. Settling into a comfortable jog, I kept my eyes on the press conference's closed captioning thread, trying to understand what the update was covering. The camera view switched to show a handsome teenager in a button-up shirt and khakis, standing beside his mother, a bashful grin on his face as she gripped him around his waist. "Grateful to have him home. Please give us privacy as we spend this time with our son." I jabbed the stop session button on the treadmill and grabbed my phone. Despite the halting pace, my heartbeat increased. Had the latest Bloody Heart victim escaped? Along with most Angelinos, I'd spent the last 3 years glued to the coverage, following each tragic case from disappearance to death. An escape victim, especially one in healthy condition, seemed impossible. This was the time frame when a victim's dead body was typically found, his penis crudely removed, his nude corpse given the same amount of care as a discarded cigarette. This killer was unique and precise, his expertise proven through 6 victims. I was stunned that he would be careless enough to allow for an escape. Could this be a copycat killer? A hoax? Or a weak moment in strategy and execution? I unlocked my phone and searched for the latest news article, then glanced back up at the muted television. escaped from the BH killer, and ran for miles until he found his way home. There it was. Confirmation in black and white. How had Scott Hardin escaped? I stepped off the machine, hurried through the busy cardio area, and hit the stairs, jogging down the wide steps toward the gym's lower level. As I reached the bottom step, the phone's display changed, and my ringtone sounded through the headphones. The call was from my office, and I put my second earbud in place and answered it. "Hello? Dr. Moore?" Jacob spoke in a hushed tone. I pictured him at our reception desk, his wire-frame glasses slipping down his nose, a bead of sweat already halfway down one side of his acne-scarred forehead. "Hi, Jacob." I pushed open the door to the ladies' locker room and grabbed a fluffy monogrammed towel off the top of the stack. "There's a detective here to see you." "Ted Sachs?" "He said it's urgent." I squeezed past a cluster of neon-clad yoga enthusiasts and found my locker. "Did he say what it's about?" "He won't tell me, and he's refusing to leave." Shit. It had been almost 6 hours since my voicemail from John Abbott, and I'd heard nothing but silence. Had something happened? Or was this visit about one of my other clients? "I'll head back now." I balanced the cell phone against my shoulder as I worked my running shorts past my hips. "Oh, and Jacob?" "Yes?" "Don't let him go in my office, and don't give him any information. I don't care what he asks for." Our part-time receptionist, who tuned pianos and ate shark-shaped gummy snacks for lunch, didn't miss a beat. "Done and done." "Thanks." I ended the call and paused, my shorts around my ankles, my red cotton thong in full display of anyone in the area. Scrolling down to John's voicemail, I quickly deleted the file, then went into my deleted voicemails and cleared out the backup record of it. The act was instinctual. My psychiatry training would blame it on a childhood history of covering my tracks and hiding anything that would spur my alcoholic mother into rage. But here, there wasn't a risk of a belligerent housewife slapping me across the face. The ramifications of John Abbott harming his wife, if that's what this was about, would be much worse. A potential investigation into my practice. A review by the medical board. Media attention on me and my clients who demanded complete confidentiality. After all, I didn't treat workaholics with insecurity issues. I specialized in killers, depraved, volatile killers. Setting my cell on the bench, I stepped out of the shorts and spun the combination dial of the locker, anxious to get to the office and get this over with. Detective Ted Sachs was a tall officer in a cheap gray suit, his shield hanging from a lanyard around his neck. I unlocked my office and gestured to the duo of soft green chairs that faced my desk. "Please, take a seat." Out of spite or stubbornness, he stayed on his feet. I made my way around and dropped my purse in the side drawer of my desk before sinking into my leather rolling chair. "How can I help you?" Leaning forward, he dropped an evidence bag on the middle of the clean wooden surface. I picked up the clear bag and examined the item inside. It was one of my business cards. The discreet style with just my name, doctor designation, and the office number. On the back was my cell phone number, written in my handwriting. I glanced back up at him. "Where'd you find this?" "In John Abbott's wallet." He removed a set of aviator glasses off the top of his bald head and looped them through the neck of his button-up shirt. This guy was straight out of Central Casting. Thin and hard, with jet-black skin and a distrustful scowl. "Do you know Mr. Abbott?" he asked. The lingering concern that John Abbott would act out morphed into alarm. What had he done? Placing the evidence bag down, I cleared my throat as my mind worked overtime through the possibilities. "Yes, he's a client of mine." The American Psychological Association's Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct was firm on the confidentiality owed to clients. It was also clear that that confidentiality could be broken if I thought my client was a danger to himself or others. John Abbott's prior sessions in which he described his struggles with wanting to harm his wife, technically fell into reportable arenas. His voicemail this morning could easily classify as an alarming incident worthy of police intervention. But it had only been a voicemail. An insecure man saying the same thing he had said to me in a year's worth of sessions. Just because he toyed with the idea of killing Brooke didn't mean he ever would. And if I called the police every time one of my clients thought about killing someone, I'd put a lot of innocent people in jail and deplete my client list. The truth is, wanting to harm or kill someone is a common part of the human mental circus. While there are some moral saints out there who have never wished ill on anyone, 20% of human beings have weighed the pros and cons of killing someone at some point in their lives. 5% have the moral flexibility to act on the possibility. 0.1% obsess over it, and the best-intentioned of those seek psychiatric help with their fixation. My clients were the best of the worst, and I felt a fierce sense of duty to protect them while treating their most honest confessions. After all, their thoughts weren't actions. People didn't die from mental activities. It was only if those thoughts turned into actions. That was the dangerous risk in this game I played with clients on a daily basis. Now, with a detective sitting across from me, the signs were clear. In John Abbott's game, I had lost, and the risks had won. Sachs cleared his throat. John Abbott didn't show up to work this morning. His co-workers grew concerned, and one went by to see if he was okay. That's when the police were called. I placed a hand on my chest, rubbing the soft silk of my dress shirt and willing my heartbeat to calm. I was about to ask if John was in custody when the detective continued. The bodies were both on the kitchen floor. The pharmacy employee saw Mr. Abbott's through the window. All of my thoughts skittered to a stop. Bodies? Mr. Abbott's? It looks like Brooke Abbott had a heart attack while they were eating breakfast. We found her husband next to her, an apparent suicide. I frowned. What? Are you sure? The man was stabbed in the stomach. The angle and situation led us to believe it was self-inflicted. I tried not to picture Brooke Abbott, whom I had met just last month in a freak run-in at the grocery store. A pretty woman, kind eyes, a friendly smile. She had greeted me warmly, with no idea of the dozens of conversations I'd had with her husband about why killing her was a bad idea. A year of sessions, and Brooke Abbott had died of a heart attack within hours of him calling me? I didn't believe it. What were you treating John for? I clicked my tongue. That's confidential, Detective. Oh, come on, he scoffed. The patient's deceased. Get me a warrant, I said. Look, I'm sorry, but I'm bound by a code of ethics. And I'm sure you stretch the boundaries of that code, he snorted. We all know what your specialty is, Dr. Moore. He finally sat, which was unfortunate, because I was now ready for him to leave. Doc of Death? Isn't that what they call you? I sighed at the moniker. Violent tendencies and obsessions are my specialty, but they aren't the only type of disorders I treat. Many of my clients are perfectly normal and pleasant individuals. The lie rolled out smoothly. I hadn't had a normal client in a decade. He smirked. Killers, he said. You treat killers. Current, future, and past. You'll have to forgive me, Doc. I call it like I see it. Well, like I said, I can't discuss Mr. Abbott. When's the last time you spoke with him? The tap dance was beginning. I chose my words carefully, mindful that they were probably already aware of his calls. Our last appointment was 2 weeks ago. He canceled the one scheduled for this week, and he called me this morning. I missed his call and called him back several hours later, but he didn't respond. Sachs didn't seem surprised by the information, which meant that they already had his call log. Thank God I hadn't left a voicemail. What did he say when he called you? Just asked me to give him a call. I'd like to hear that voicemail. I sighed. I deleted it. I'm sorry. I didn't think anything of it. He nodded, as if he understood. But if he was looking at this as a heart attack and suicide, he didn't. That number on your card, that's the one he called? The number on the back? Yes, that's my cell. You give your cell phone number to all your clients? He frowned. Even the dangerous ones? It's a cell phone. I sat back in the chair. It's not my home address or the code to my front door. If they abuse it, then I stop working with them. If I need to change the number, I'll change the number. It's not a big deal. Coming from someone who looks at dead bodies all day, I have to say, Doc, I don't think you take your safety seriously. You're an attractive woman. All it takes is one of these sickos becoming obsessed with you, and you're going to have a serious problem. I appreciate the advice. I forced a smile, but they aren't sickos. They're normal people, Detective. Some people struggle with depression, others struggle with violent urges. If my clients didn't care about protecting others, they wouldn't be in my office. Is that why John Abbott was seeing you? He didn't want to hurt people? I kept my features pleasant. Like I said, I treat clients for a variety of things. Some just need someone to talk to. You want to know more than that? I need a warrant. Hey, I had to try, he said, raising his hands in surrender. Glancing toward my window, he studied the park view for a long moment. Any reason I should look at this as anything other than a suicide? He was questioning the wrong death. Not that I'm aware of. Would you swear to that under oath? Absolutely. Just please don't ask me about Brooke. He nodded slowly. I'll be in touch if I have any more questions, Dr. Moore. He pushed on the arms of the chair and stood. Thank you for your time. I walked him to the lobby and gave a reassuring smile to Jacob, who watched us with interest. Returning to my office, I closed the door and let out a shuddered breath. The chances were high, very high, that this was my fault. I'd had one job to do, and I had failed in an epic way with Brooke. But also John. Because of that, 2 people were dead. Chapter 3. This isn't your fault. Meredith squinted at me over a Brussels sprout-laden tuna fish sandwich. Tell me you know that. While I appreciate your emotional life, Raft, you're wrong. I stabbed my fork into a piece of melon and prosciutto. He sought treatment with me because he wanted to kill his wife. He killed his wife. He killed himself. If I'd done my job properly, they'd both be alive. Okay, first, you have no proof he killed his wife. She spoke through a mouthful of food, one finger lifted in the air as she started to count off a list of bullshit. She had a heart attack. Someone can trigger a heart attack. I set down my fork. He was a pharmacist, trust me. Then call the detective. Have him run a tox screen. She waited, her sandwich hovering before her mouth. You know I can't do that, I said grudgingly, lowering my voice as I glanced around the crowded downtown cafe. You can do that, she pointed out. You just don't want to. Because then I might be right, and you'll have to release this self-imposed guilt and move on with your life in a happy and productive manner. This was why I shouldn't have befriended a fellow shrink. We couldn't have a simple lunch without analyzing each other. I studied the stamped design along the rim of my plate. I shouldn't do that, I amended, for several reasons. I could waste our entire lunch going over why that was a horrible idea. If I was wrong and Brooke's death was natural, I'd be a laughingstock who tried to tarnish my own client's name. If I was right, and my client had killed his wife, I'd be under a microscope, would have to turn over his files, and for what? For justice on a man who had already imposed his own death sentence? It was a waste of government resources and time. Meredith took a sip of herbal tea and shrugged. Whatever, dig your own mental grave. Did you call that guy whose number I gave you? The handyman? I did not call the handyman. I tore off a piece of bread. I appreciate the matchmaking, but I already have one new man in my life, and I don't need another. A pack of Mr. Clean sponges doesn't count. She frowned at me and picked a sprout off the front of her blouse. Yeah, well, he's the first man inside my house, other than my brother, in... I squinted and did the depressing math. 18 months? So I'm counting it as a step in the right direction. Even more reason to call Mimo. Have you had an Italian before? She let out a low whistle. Honey, it's a spiritual experience. Besides, he's a total sweetheart. So you said. I placed a forkful of cold melon in my mouth. Oh, did you hear? She perked up, her handyman forgotten. They caught the Bloody Heart killer. Amid the news of John Abbott's death, I'd forgotten. I missed the full story. What happened? I took a sip of ice water. The kid escaped? Right. That Beverly High senior, the one who's been gone 7 weeks. She took a sip of tea, paused, then coughed, her fist in front of her mouth as she hacked out whatever was bothering her. Sorry about that. The BH victim? I prompted her. So, he escapes from the guy and makes it back to his Beverly Hills mansion, where his parents freak out. Prodigal son has returned, blah, 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 and they call the police. Turns out, the kid knows who the killer is. She pointed her finger at me. Get this. The guy's a teacher at Beverly High. Wow. I leaned in closer. What do we know about him? Loner, never married, harmless-looking guy. Looks like a mall Santa Claus. Won Teacher of the Year a decade ago. That's interesting. I mulled over the information. I wonder why he just now targeted a Beverly High kid. Normally, it's the first victim who's in easy and close proximity. She shrugged. Killers are your thing. I'm perfectly happy to stay on my side of the office with my orgasm-hungry lacrosse moms. Speaking of which, I glanced at my watch. I've got an appointment in 45, so I need to wrap this up. Yeah, I've got to run over to the dry cleaner anyway. She half raised her hand, catching the attention of our waiter, who fished the bill portfolio out of his apron and placed it on the table. I reached for it. I got it. Thanks for the counseling session. Placing a few bills down on the table, I stole one last sip of water and stood. I needed to hurry. A wannabe killer was probably already in my lobby, tapping her 4-inch stilettos and waiting. Chapter 4. You know, most killers start with a close family member or friend. This fact was delivered by Layla Grant, who wore a bright yellow dress with a white cardigan and had a designer purse tucked between her turquoise blue heels. In the first 30 minutes of our appointment, she had complained about her husband, chattered enthusiastically about the addition of a salad bar to her country club's lunch hour, and shown me photos of 2 chaise lounge options she was considering for her lanai. After we made the excruciating choice to go with the white and green cushioned bamboo chaise, we finally circled around to why I was treating her. Her violent fantasies toward her husband's sister. Yes, I'm aware of that statistic. I drew a small line of roses along the top of my notepad and made a mental reminder to order a funeral spray for John and Brooke's service. The problem is that she lives so close. He's going to want to go to her house for Christmas dinner, and what can I say? I have no good excuse. Sarah's house is bigger than ours. Her kids haven't seen him in months, and she makes some lemon pie he won't shut up about. I mean, it's lemon pie. How spectacular could it be? I shrugged. I don't like pie. Well, a pie is a pie. I told him that, and he got offended. Let me tell you, I've made 100 pies for that man, and he's never raved about any of them. I should be the one who's offended. Honestly, Gwen, I don't think I can sit at her table and watch her waltz in with that dessert and not turn violent. Do you realize how many knives are going to be at that table? Her cheeks sucked in with worry, an act that further ballooned her injected lips. Her forehead, defying all natural odds, remained perfectly smooth. "You're not going to pick up a knife and stab her," I said patiently. "I think I am. You don't know how often I've seen it in my head." An almost dreamy calm came over Layla's face as she worked through the bloodshed in her mind. Her lids snapped open. "Can't you give me a doctor's note, something to get me out of this?" "We have 2 months until Christmas," I pointed out. "Let's take things one at a time." I moved the conversation in a better direction. "I'd like you to tell me something nice about Sarah." "What do you mean?" "Share something that you like about her, a redeeming quality." She looked at me as if I were insane. I waited, patiently, my hands folded over each other on the pad. Layla wasn't a killer, though she certainly wanted to be. She was bored, had watched too many female murder documentaries on TV, and hated her sister-in-law. Who didn't hate someone? I had a list of at least 3 people I'd rather do without. Would I grab a turkey knife and go for their jugular? No. But neither would Layla. She just liked the idea of being interesting, and the thought that she had a secret and underlying homicidal inclination was a rainy day fantasy she had embraced with maniacal vigor. "I'm going to give you some homework." I picked up my pen. "Before next week's appointment, come up with 3 things that you like or admire about Sarah." I held up my hand to stop her objection. "Don't tell me you can't come up with 3 things. Figure it out, or postpone our next appointment until you do." She twisted her watermelon-colored lips into a grimace. I gave her a reassuring smile and stood. "I think we made good progress today." She reached down and gripped the handles of her purse. "I hate this homework." I stifled a laugh, then threw her an emotional crutch. "If we're going to keep your impulses in check, we have to retrain the way your brain looks at Sarah. Trust me, this is important to your treatment. And your marriage," I added silently. "Fine," she huffed to her feet. "Thanks, Doc." "Of course." I rose and swallowed the new and foreign swell of insecurity that was rising in my chest. I'd been wrong to believe that Brooke Abbott was safe from her husband. Was I missing the mark on Layla Grant, too? Chapter 5. I stood in a sea of black-suited strangers and listened to everyone talk about John, as if he were a saint. It was Christmas Eve, and he came into the pharmacy, just for me. Someone had stolen my bag at the gym, and I needed my heart medication. The older woman put her hand over her large bosom, right next to a gold butterfly brooch. Oh, bless John and his heart medicine to the rescue. Honestly, it's the nicest people you have to worry the most about. Ed Gein, the killer who famously created suits of women's skin, was described as the nicest man in town. Dr. Harold Shipman, who murdered over 200 patients, would make home visits and had a soothing and polite bedside manner. Part of the game for many killers is the con of the innocent, the hiding of the monster, the successful deception that proves to them that they are smarter and therefore superior. On the rainy days, John brought in my newspaper, said he worried about me making it down my drive with my cane. A younger man with braces on his legs spoke in a hushed tone, and I maneuvered around the group, beelining for the coffee station. You could just see the love they had. You know it would have been their 15-year anniversary this year. Another tight cluster of mourners, this discussion led by a woman with short-cropped hair that was a bright shade of magenta. Sure, 15 years of him hovering over her with a critical eye, picking her apart for harmless conversations and friendships. In a year, I had barely scratched the surface of where John's insecurities and control issues came from, but they seemed to swell and ebb around Brooke's behavior. They had been married 15 years, but John's complicated mix of emotions for his wife had only ramped into violent inclinations in the last year. He had first sought my help when an argument between them had led him to wrap his hands around her neck and squeeze until she fainted. The act had given him a rush of sexual endorphins and caused her to emotionally withdraw, which was akin to a child running from a large dog. Ears went up, tail twitched, chase time on. John may have brought newspapers in for neighbors with disabilities and opened the pharmacy on the weekend for heart medicine distribution, but he had also calculated medicine combinations that would kill his wife and mused about locking her in his car trunk on a hot summer day to teach her a lesson about loyalty and trust. With the exception of his first choking incident, the rest of his fantasies we had controlled through regular sessions and prescribed medications, the latter of which he often skipped or ignored altogether. I stopped at the end of a long receiving line. Ahead of us was a trio of family members. I watched their faces as the line shuffled forward, curious if any of them had seen the monster behind the man. Strangling her would be best. For my enjoyment, I mean. I like the idea of looking in her eyes, of her understanding what is happening. Otherwise, I'm worried she'll get distracted by the pain. I'd spent the last 4 days thinking over our sessions. Each night, I'd listened to the recordings of our appointments, focusing on the excited lilt of his voice as he had described the different ways he would hurt her. In hindsight, there were far too many signs. A gradual ramp-up of intensity between his first visit and last. I'd heard it and made notes, yet I'd been foolish enough to believe that the power of my counsel was enough to keep him in line. My ego, that was what had killed Brooke. I paused in front of John's sister, her mascara streaked down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I told her. I stepped to the side and repeated the routine with his brother. They were both thin and bookish, a marked contrast to John's large frame. "Mrs. Caldwell," I nodded to Brooke's mother, who was sagging in place, her face etched in deep lines of sorrow, all color faded from her skin. "I did this. I'm the reason she no longer has a daughter." I could have broken my physician's code of silence if I believed my patient was an imminent and violent threat to others. I could have gone to the police, shared everything John told me. But then what? They would have questioned him, questioned her, and then released him. You can't arrest someone for thinking about killing someone. They would have let him go. She might have left him over the event, and he might have killed her then. Justification. The problem with the initials after my name was that I could smell my own bullshit. I snuck out early and ended up at a bar 2 blocks down from the funeral home. I claimed a booth in the back, one tucked behind a pool table and beside a crooked dartboard. It was quiet, the bar half empty, and I slid into the plastic seat and pulled a metal bucket of dusty peanuts toward me. The waitress was heavily pregnant and lumbered over with a disinterested yawn. I saved her a few extra trips by ordering a bucket of beer. "Getting anything to eat?" Her gaze drifted over my black pantsuit with the sort of curiosity that indicated ironed outfits rarely made their way through the doors. "Just the beer." I forced a smile. "You guys with some sort of convention?" "Excuse me?" She pointed toward the entrance. "You and him." I followed her direction and saw a man in a 3-piece suit on a stool at the bar. "No." She shrugged. "Okay. If you need more peanuts, let me know." The jukebox started up, some twangy song about Amarillo in the morning. I eased down in the booth until my head rested against the cushion. I hadn't been to a bar in a decade, which might be why I was still single. It was hard to find a boyfriend when you spent the bulk of your time surrounded by fellow shrinks and psychotic patients. The last time I'd stepped foot in a bar, the delicate sounds of a pianist played, as hushed conversations were held beneath expensive light fixtures. I'd sipped a handcrafted drink garnished with spices and served in a smoked tumbler. This place was the polar opposite. The sort of establishment where mistakes were made and sorrows were drowned, which was exactly why I'd paused by the entrance and pushed open the door. If I could drink away the last 2 hours, maybe I could get to sleep without the vision of Brooke Abbott's mother sobbing against the side of the casket. "Here," the waitress was back, heaving a metal pail full of Bud Light bottles onto the table. "If we fill up, you'll have to move to the bar. The booths are for parties of 2 or more." I nodded. If they filled up, I'd be out the door and flagging down a taxi. I took a beer from the ice and twisted off the cap, chugging it until my brain flexed in response to the chill. 2 beers later, I returned from the bathroom and reclaimed my seat, my remaining bottles cockeyed and waiting in the ice. I picked up a sticky menu tent and reviewed the short list of offerings. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I made a vow a long time ago to stop any woman who was about to make a huge mistake." I looked up from the card and into a face that looked as tired as mine. He wore it better than I did, his handsomeness almost magnified by the deep lines in his brow. "What mistake is that?" "You were thinking about the fish dip, right?" The corner of his mouth crooked up, revealing a hint of straight teeth. He was my age, late 30s, and I checked for a wedding band, my interest rising at the sight of his bare ring finger. Not that a relationship was what I wanted. Right now, with guilt weighing down every thought, I just needed a mistake. One filthy, mind-numbing mistake. If it came wrapped in an expensive suit and bedroom eyes, even better. "I was actually thinking about oysters." He winced. As a man who spent the last hour sampling every item on that menu, I recommend the wings and nothing else. "Sold." I set the tent card down and held out my hand. "I'm Gwen. Robert." He shook it firmly, but not to the point of dominance. "Bad day?" "Bad week." I gestured to the other side of the booth, inviting him to sit. "You?" "Same." He slid in, and his leg bumped against mine. "Want to talk about it?" "Hell no." I pulled out a bottle and offered it to him. "Beer?" He took it. I have to say, I've never seen a beautiful woman drink alone for so long without being approached. I think I put off a pretty clear stay-away vibe. I glanced around. Plus, there's no one here. Which is shocking given the ambience, he deadpanned. I laughed. "Yeah, but I don't know. It fits my mood." I leaned forward and wrapped my hands around the bottle. "With this glass, rich and deep, we cradle all our sorrows to sleep." I gave a wistful smile. My dad used to say that, though he was a Scotchman, not Bud Light. He studied me. "What are you doing here? You seem like more of an uptown girl." I had to smile at the polite dig. "A snob," I amended. "That's what you're saying." "I'm saying you carry hand sanitizer in your purse and played Taylor Swift on the jukebox," he pointed out. "To say you don't fit in here is putting it mildly." I warmed at the knowledge that he had been watching me, then immediately reminded myself of why I was there. Punishment, atonement. 2 people were dead on my watch. "I was in the neighborhood." I caught the waitress's eyes. "You?" He grimaced. "Attending a funeral." I paused, surprised. "The Abbott funeral?" He raised his brow. "Yeah. You?" "Same." I frowned. "I didn't see you there." Not that I'd been studying the crowd. "I left pretty early. I don't do well at funerals, especially lately." A shadow passed over his face. It's been a bad year for me with deaths. I didn't need my psychiatry degree to know to avoid that minefield. The pain was radiating off him, and if it was from this funeral, my guilt was about to get worse. I gave a slight nod in response. His eyebrows pinched together in thought. "Who were you a friend of, Brooke or John?" "A friend?" I'd be lying either way. "Brooke," I said, and wished it were true. He nodded. John was my pharmacist. Wow. I took a sip of my beer. Good for you. I don't even know mine's name, much less would attend her funeral. My son had diabetes, he said quietly. We were frequent customers. Ah. Had diabetes. A bad year for funerals. Unless someone recently found a cure for juvenile diabetes, I had an answer for the haunted look in his eyes. Well, I lifted my beer. To John and Brooke. To John and Brooke. He clinked bottles with me, then downed the rest of his without flinching. The waitress paused by our table and pulled the empty bucket of ice toward the edge. Did you want to order something? Yes. 12 wings, please, mild. And another bucket of beer. Robert threw an arm over the back of the booth, and his jacket gaped open, revealing the expensive lines of his vest. A custom suit, the glint of a Rolex peeking out of the sleeve of his jacket. A comfort level in this atmosphere where he obviously didn't fit, bred from pure confidence. A businessman or attorney, probably the latter. I really shouldn't have any more. I turned my watch so I could see the dial. 7:30. It felt so much later. I'll drink them all. He reached in his pocket and pulled out 2 pills. Putting one in his mouth, he put the other on the bar napkin in front of me. Take this. It'll help with your hangover tomorrow. I looked at the round white tablet without touching it. What is it? B6. You're supposed to take it prior to, during, and after drinking, but any of it helps. He nodded to the pill. Go ahead. It doesn't bite. I slid the napkin toward him. Not gonna happen. It's all you. He chuckled. You're either anti-remedy, drinking to punish yourself for something, or you don't trust me. The last 2. I took a small sip of beer. No offense. None taken. He picked up the pill and put it on his tongue, a flash of white teeth showing before it disappeared in his mouth. What are you punishing yourself for? I made a mistake at work. I moved my beer in a small circle on the table, watching as it left a path of condensation. Must have been a big one. It was. Let me guess. He tilted his head to one side and did an obvious up and down of my pantsuit. Accountant. I curled my upper lip in distaste. No. Studio exec. I laughed, because in this town, everyone wanted to be in the movies. No. Psychiatrist. Ah. Definitely not anti-remedy, then. He studied me. Expensive watch and bag, and the freedom to be entering bars in questionable areas of town just in time for happy hour. You must have a private practice. Let me guess. Housewives with inferiority complexes. Private practice, yes. Housewives, no. I narrowed my eyes at him. If you're a cop, you aren't a great one. Definitely not a cop. I sit on the other side of that courtroom. He gave an unapologetic smirk. Defense attorney. I sat up straighter, my interest piqued at the specialty. White-collar crimes? Mostly criminal. Here in Los Angeles County? And Orange. Personal or property crime. He regarded me over the top of his beer. You're suddenly full of questions. I'm called in for expert testimony a lot. I'm surprised our paths haven't crossed. There are thousands of cases a year, he said slowly. I'd be surprised if they did. What's your specialty? I was too drunk for this interview. I cleared my throat and attempted a mask of composure. Personality disorders and violent compulsions. You get more interesting with each moment, Dr. Gwen. Wings? A man in a cowboy hat stopped by our table, a basket in hand. They were really pushing the Western bar concept too far. I raised my hand. Those are mine. My house was closest, and I was laughing when I stumbled out of the taxi, my fingers latched through his as we made it across the dark stepping stones and up the stacked stone steps of my house. From the swing at the end of the porch, Clementine mewed. Robert stared into the darkness. "Nice kitty." I ignored him and got the door open. He followed me closely, his hands roaming as he peeled off my jacket and kissed the back of my neck. I dropped my head back, enjoying the soft press of his lips against the neglected spot, one that sent a tremor of need down my spine. My last sexual encounter had been the result of a blind date and had involved a half-hearted erection and lots of stifled yawns on my end as I'd eyed the clock and yearned for bed. The foyer lamp was on, the light picking up the turquoise colors in the oil painting of Alcatraz Island. Robert pushed me against the navy wall, palming my breast through my shirt as his mouth settled on mine. He was a talented kisser, confident yet gentle, and I sank against the molding and let him take control. I kicked off one heel, then the other, dropping in height as he undid the top button of my blouse. "Come on." I pulled to one side, tugging on his hand as I led the way up the dark wooden stairs to my bedroom. Pushing open the door, I felt a wave of calm and reassurance at the perfectly made bed and orderly room. While I had chosen dramatic and dark colors for the living room and foyer, my bedroom was all crisp white, from the walls to the bedding to the soft, plush rug that stretched over the walnut floor. The only color came from the neat stack of novels and the fresh lilies on my bedside table, and the large fireplace, which shimmered with inlaid mirror shards set into brick. I'd paid a fortune for that fireplace, and had been worth every penny. If he was impressed by the room, he said nothing, staying silent as I crawled onto the taut expanse of the white monogrammed duvet and turned to face him. He pulled off his jacket slowly, then unbuttoned his shirt, giving me time to think, to analyze, to back out. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't been with a man in over a year, but there was no hesitation in me. I unbuttoned my pants and shimmied out of them. The bed sank as he joined me on it, and I reached for him, greedy for the warmth of his skin and the reconnection of our kiss. The heat of our bodies joined, and it was exactly what I needed. A living connection in a day filled with death. Chapter 6. I woke up to the smell of toast and coffee. It was comforting and familiar, reminiscent of my childhood, and I closed my eyes for an extra moment before jerking fully awake. My bedroom was in perfect order, as it always was. Dresser clean and uncluttered, curtains pulled closed, clock at a 45-degree angle to the vase of lilies, which were beginning to wilt. My watch on the bedside table, next to the novels. The smell of food was out of place. So were the footsteps coming from downstairs. The lawyer. I pinched my eyes closed and tried to place his name. Robert. Robert without a last name. We'd debated the death penalty during the cab ride here. Oh my God, my car. It was still in the parking garage 3 blocks down from the funeral home. I slowly sat up, appreciating the sore ache of my muscles. Robert had been... A grin pulled at my lips. Fantastic. Was that what sex was supposed to be like? God, to think of all the years I had wasted on mediocre lovemaking. I pulled back the covers and swung my legs over the side of the high bed, surprised that I was naked except for an oversized Star Wars t-shirt that I'd purchased online. Robert had liked the shirt, chuckling as he had returned from my closet with it in hand. I looked around for my underwear, but didn't see it. Pushing to my feet, I winced at the pain in my head. I should have taken that B12 or B6 or whatever it had been. Just the fact he was up and cooking breakfast was proof it worked. I brushed my teeth and pulled on a fresh pair of underwear and a pair of faded jeans. Buttoning up the fly, I quietly made my way down the stairs and toward the kitchen. The grin that stretched across my cheeks fell as soon as I passed the open double doors to my office and saw Robert standing at my desk, looking down at an open client file. John Abbott's file. I'd left it out, my review abandoned yesterday afternoon, when I'd stopped to dress for the funeral. As I watched, he lifted up the edge of a page. "What are you doing?" He looked up, unperturbed by my tone. "I thought you said you were Brooke's friend." I entered the office, my anger growing at his lack of apology. "These are confidential patient files." "Confidential patient files for John Abbott." He tapped the page. "John was a patient of yours?" "You need to leave." I snapped, my warm and fuzzy feelings fleeing at the thought of what he had seen. What was the liability here? I'd left patient files out in the open, but in the privacy of my own home. Had he broken any laws? Had I? He dropped the file and stepped away from the desk. "What are you doing in here?" I closed the file and wrapped a rubber band around it. "Is this what you do? You sleep with someone and then go through all their things?" "I had to check my work messages. My cell's battery is dead." He nodded to the phone on my desk. "I didn't have a charger, and you don't have a phone in the kitchen. This was the first room where I found one. I'm sorry." His name caught my eye. I opened my drawer and pushed the folder into it. "You should go. I can order a car for you if your phone is dead." He didn't move, and my frustration grew. "You know what confidentiality I'm bound to. You have a very similar one with your clients," I said. "You should have told me that you were John's shrink." "Why?" I gave a strangled laugh. "You were a stranger in a bar. I didn't owe you confidential information about a client." "A dead client," he pointed out. "It doesn't matter. My legal obligations don't change." I crossed my arms over my chest and glared at him. "Okay," he said finally, his jaw tight. "Fine. No need to call me a car. Thank you for the hospitality." He picked up his jacket from where he'd folded it over a chair and walked into the hall. I stayed in place and listened as his dress shoes sounded down the hall and out the front door. There was a quiet click as it latched back into place. From the kitchen, something wafted smoke in the air. I picked up the phone's receiver and listened to the dial tone. I studied the bank of buttons, then reached forward and pressed the redial button. An unknown number with a 310 area code displayed. Holding my breath, I listened as the phone rang once and then went to a voicemail for Cluster and Kavin Law Firm. I hung up. So, he had called his office. Cluster and Kavin. I paused halfway through to the hall and inhaled sharply, suddenly aware of who Robert was. Robert Kavin, the father of Gabe. Chapter 7. Robert Kavin stopped at the end of Gwen's driveway and looked to either side, surveying the quiet neighborhood. It was well established, the yards neatly tended to, the cars all tucked behind garage doors. He'd liked her house, liked the perfect order and care it held. It was a home with character, her style elegant with an edge. The skull paperweight tucked into her bookcase, the framed blood-splattered prints hanging in her powder room, the rich navy walls, books everywhere, art that seemed to have a story behind every piece. He wanted to know those stories, wanted to unlock the brilliant and sexy woman who had crawled on top of him in the back seat of the cab with an infectious laugh that had contrasted with her professional exterior. His warm feelings toward her had dissolved the moment he saw that file on her desk. He'd only had a chance to read a few pages before she had interrupted him, but it had been enough to know that her sessions with John Abbott had been highly personal in nature. Personal and full of violence. He glanced back at the two-story Tudor and headed left down the street, cursing himself for his phone's dead battery. He hadn't paid attention to his bearings when the taxi took them home last night, but he headed north, hoping the road would lead to a neighborhood exit, preferably one with a gas station or strip mall nearby. He fisted his jacket in his left hand and moved to the shaded side of the street. Even in October, the California heat was a bitch. If his son were here, he'd laugh at him. Gabe would make some crack about Robert getting literally screwed. He'd ask why he'd stormed off instead of talking things out with Gwen. And if Robert would say that he tried to, and she had clammed up and spouted about confidentiality, Gabe would point out that he'd have done the same thing. Which was true. 20 years of dealing with clients, some really terrible clients, and he'd never broken their confidence. Granted, a one-night stand had never gone through his case files either. He grimaced at the thought of what his reaction would be if one did. Calm reactions weren't his strong suit. A Volvo with Stanford decals passed, and he watched it go, reluctant to flag down a stranger. Ahead, a cart path sign said, "Clubhouse," with a small arrow. That couldn't be too far. The neighborhood felt familiar, like the one Gabe's first girlfriend had lived in. Her parents had thrown a 4th of July party, and all but forced him to attend. It had been in the middle of the Zentenberg trial, and he'd barely had the energy to stand, but he'd gone. Talk about a painful 3 hours. The same conversation over and over again about the Chargers, then the forest fires, then the election. A nonstop circle of dull conversation. If Natasha had been alive, she would have gone to that party with him. She liked that stuff. She could stand there, a drink in hand, and laugh at stupid comments as if they were the wittiest thing she'd ever heard. And it didn't come across as fake, which was commendable, considering that she always ripped apart the person as soon as they were out of earshot. It was one thing he hadn't missed about her, the backbiting and judgment that never seemed to stop. Around the curve, the golf clubhouse appeared. He stepped over a curb and turned down the wide drive, his pace quickening at the prospect of a phone and air conditioning. He glanced at his watch, wondering if the bar would be open, despite the early hour. Right now, what he really needed was a drink. The bar was open and empty, his Scotch order taken with a grunt. Leaning back on the stool, he stretched his back, sighing as something popped into place. He was too old for marathon sex, and last night had been the first time in a while that he had been so active. Gwen had been a surprise in bed. Passionate and needy, but also confident. She hadn't covered herself up when he looked at her, or apologized for the cellulite along her thighs. Maybe that confidence came from sitting across from killers all day. His mood darkened, and he pulled the drink closer. A tearful reunion. He glanced at the television and caught the tail end of a video with a family embracing. His mood soured further. Crazy stuff, right? The bartender leaned against the bar, his palms tucked underneath his armpits. Yep. Robert stared into the glass. Scott Harden and his miraculous escape was the last thing he wanted to hear about. You heard about this, right? That missing kid, you know, the one they thought was taken by that serial killer? He escaped from the guy. The missing kid. Not Gabe, who hadn't been able to escape. Scott Harden. Lucky Scott Harden. Robert's emotions rose as the television announcers recapped the escape and reunion. The camera cut to a summary of the BH history, and he downed the rest of the watered-down drink. Gabe's name was mentioned, and he slammed down the tumbler. Pulling out his wallet, he retrieved a $20 bill and placed it on the bar. Thanks. Sure. His anxiety rose as he heard Gabe's name again. Were they showing the photos? His bare foot hanging out from under the tarp? A bloody letter jacket? He made it out of the lobby and through the front doors and saw the taxi moving down the drive toward him. Raising his hand to catch its attention, he closed his eyes but couldn't block out the image, the one they always showed. His son, smiling into the camera with his football jersey on, the one taken just 8 weeks before he was killed. Chapter 8. Nita Hardin had expected her son to be skinny. Somehow, against all odds, her son had grown thicker. Now, as Scott sat in a wing-back chair in the study, his white button-up shirt was snug against a chest dotted with small cigarette burns that were starting to scab over. Seated before him, Detective Erica Petz adjusted a dial on a voice recorder, then set it on her knees. She'd been the first to the house when Scott had disappeared and had listened to countless questions, tears, and complaints from George and Nita during the duration of his absence. If you get tired or need a break, just let me know. And take your time if you need to think over a question. The detective leaned forward in her chair, her full attention on Scott. Yes, ma'am. He was such a polite boy. That was one thing that George had done a great job of. Back in first grade, Scott was using please and thank you before he knew how to write. Nita's pride swelled as she watched him rub the side of his handsome face. Okay, we're recording this just so we don't miss anything. The other cops settled into the third chair in the cluster. Detective Ed Harvey was a big, burly man with glasses. He'd always put off a clear, get out of our way and let us do our job vibe that had infuriated her. Now that Scott was home, Ed's attitude had switched to one of suspicion, though she couldn't figure out of whom. Nita leaned against the wall, nodding her hands as she watched Ed offer Scott a soda. It was a brand he didn't like, and she left the room and hurried to the kitchen. In the large double fridge, she found a can of root beer. Returning to the study, she crept forward and set it down next to him on the desk. Thanks, Mom. He smiled at her. Erica cleared her throat. How are you, Scott? He gave a shy smile. I'm good. Glad to be home. She gave a short laugh. I bet you are. Got any big plans? Well, my mom is fixing lasagna tonight. I'm pretty excited about that. Then we're going to watch Die Hard. Nita had suggested a less violent movie, but Scott had rolled his eyes and cajoled George into siding with him. Not that it had taken much work. She couldn't refuse him anything. Right now, her heart felt like it would burst every time she looked at him. She couldn't sleep at night out of the sheer relief and joy of having him back under their roof. She had broached the idea of bringing a cot into his room, but her husband had stopped that idea with a firm shake of his head. Great movie, Ed interjected. Love Bruce Willis. Yeah. Scott cracked the top of his root beer. There was a pause, and Nita shifted her weight to her other foot. You were gone for 44 days, Scott. Erica clicked her pen into action. How much do you remember about the day you were taken? Everything. I mean, well, I remember everything leading up to when I blacked out. Then I remember being at the house. Okay, so let's go to the last thing you remember, before you blacked out. Well, we had that football game against Harvard Westlake. He scratched the back of his head. And I, showered after the game. A lot of the guys were talking about going to get food, so I grabbed my gear and headed to my truck. Scott's truck had been his 17th birthday present. A huge silver four-door with off-road tires and an engine that was too loud, but he loved it. When he was missing, she had climbed up into it and sat for hours, desperately inhaling the air, needing his scent. But you never made it to the truck? Ed asked. No, I did. Next to my truck, someone was parked there. It was, the science teacher from school, Mr. Thompson. This man? Erica pulled a photo out from a folder on her lap. Nita eased around to get a better look at the image. It was a man in his late 50s, with a neat white beard, a receding hairline, and a kind smile. It was a staff photo in which he wore a lanyard and had a name tag clipped to a slightly crumpled white button-up. She stared at it. This was the monster who had taken her son. The man who had tortured and killed 6 others. The man whom she must have passed a dozen times at Beverly High and never noticed. Where had her motherly intuition been? How had it not screamed at her with a giant, glowing spotlight on his face? Yeah, that's him. The problem was, she had grown lax. Assumed that because Scott was 170 pounds and practically an adult, he was safe. A stupid assumption, one she would never make again. So, what happened? Ed asked. He needed help getting something out of his trunk. I bent over to help him, and he stuck something in my neck. Whatever it was, it knocked me out like that. Scott snapped his fingers. Where were you when you woke up? Erica asked. He hesitated, lifted his soda to his mouth and took a sip, glanced at his mother. In a room. On a bed. I was tied to it. Nita held eye contact with him until the moment he looked away. Her stomach cramped. During the weeks of Scott's absence, as they grew certain the BH killer was involved, the police had shared information with them about the other victims, the details about what the autopsies had shown. Nita let out an involuntary shudder. Scott had always been a fairly innocent boy. No serious girlfriends, though he'd had plenty of crushes over the years. Before his disappearance, she would have put her hand on a Bible and sworn he was a virgin. Now, her gaze dropped to his bandaged wrists. They had been the first thing she took care of, after she fixed him a plate of food and helped him into a hot shower. She had called Erica while Scott had been in the bathroom, and the detective practically screamed at her to get him out in order to preserve evidence. But Scott had been filthy. And he'd already known who took him, so why did evidence matter? It didn't. What mattered was healing. The police needed to wrap up their questions and leave him alone so that he could return to being a normal teenager with his family. Do you know where this house was? Was it this one? Ed produced a photo which Scott glanced at. Maybe. When I left, I just ran. I didn't look at the house. Nita watched him carefully, saw the moment he rubbed the side of his face with his forefinger. It was one of his tells, and she frowned, wondering what he was lying about. Were you in a bedroom? His bedroom? Erica asked. No, I don't think he lived there. I was drugged most of the time, so I'm not sure. The two detectives glanced at each other. You need to arrest him, Nita spoke up, before he disappears or before he comes here. We have officers with Randall Thompson now. Erica met her eyes. We're waiting on a warrant to search his home. Don't worry. He won't be out of our sight. What if he says he didn't do it? Scott asked. If it's my word against his? The evidence has a vote, Ed said. It'll be fine. Scott nodded, but he looked unconvinced. Nita moved forward. You've asked enough questions for tonight. He's exhausted, and we should have our attorney present if you have any more. Her husband watched from his place by the door and nodded his approval. He had wanted to call their attorney first, but Nita had argued with him, insisting that the most urgent thing was to get the teacher locked away. She walked the officers to the front door and hugged Erica goodbye, whispering a thank you in the woman's ear. Pausing at the door, she glanced back at her son, who was still seated. He glanced back at her, then quickly looked away. Her unease grew. Her son was keeping something from the police. What could it possibly be? And why? Chapter 9. Cluster & Kavin Law Firm was housed in the same building as the Creative Artists Agency, which meant that once a week, Robert Kavin bumped elevator elbows with a celebrity. It was a factoid that had once earned him enormous street cred with his son, back when he was young enough to be impressed. That magic had left around puberty, replaced by a bored expression that only seemed to react when money, his car, or girls were involved. One day soon, Robert would set all his files on fire and move to a shack on the beach. He'd wear board shorts and a baseball cap and not shave for a year. He'd handle cases about beach access and rental deposits and represent sandy daiquiri bars that paid in alcohol and coconut shrimp. This sleek building, pressed and starched suits, all that would be left behind. "You're daydreaming again," his receptionist spoke from her spot next to him in the elevator. A knowing smile stretched across the older woman's face. "Let me guess. Aruba? I'm thinking Uruguay now." The elevator doors slid open, and he held his hand against the opening, gesturing her forward. "Lower tax rate. Want to join me?" The stately grandmother of 3 chuckled as she stepped off the elevator. "I can't convince Fred to take the 45-minute drive to Costco. There's no chance of getting him on an airplane any time in this century." They rounded the corner and passed through the tall glass doors and into the law firm lobby. "Is Martin here?" He pulled his keys out and flipped through the set, finding the one for his office door and pushing it into the lock. Out of the 3 firm partners, he was the only one with the additional layer of security, but he didn't care. That was the difference between him and someone like Gwen, who left her files out for anyone to see. Carelessness like that was how cases were lost, secrets were spread, and careers were destroyed. "He's been here since 7. Imagine that." He flipped on the lights and tossed his keys on the desk, then headed to his partner's office. Martin was on the phone and met Robert's eyes as he came in. Nodding toward the conference table at the end of his office, he held up his finger in a just 1 minute gesture. Robert took one of the leather rolling chairs and plucked a sticky donut off a discarded plate on the edge of the massive desk. "There's coconut in that," Martin warned as he ended the call. "I swear, Joy's teaming up with my wife to get me to lose weight." "I like coconut," Robert said through a mouthful. "Right." Martin picked up the end of his tie and examined it, scratching at a spot with his fingernail. Glancing back at Robert, he paused. "I'm assuming you heard about Scott Harden returning home." "I did." Robert wiped at his mouth. "One of the detectives called." "Do they have any leads?" "Actually, the kid said it was one of his teachers. They brought the guy in for questioning, and Judge Glenn gave them a warrant this morning." "They find any evidence?" Martin tented his hands atop his stomach, his full attention on Robert. Between the 2 of them, they had freed hundreds of accused criminals from a life behind bars, and most of the time, a missing piece of evidence had been the weak link that had dictated the verdict. "They found a shoebox in his house." He met the man's eyes. "It had souvenirs from each of the boys, including Gabe." Martin winced. "I'm sorry, Rob." "It's fine." He took a final bite of the donut and forced himself to chew, his mind refusing to let go of the detective's words. "They found some of Gabe's hair in the box. It matches his DNA. There's a few other things here. A keychain. We'll need you to come down and identify it." Robert coughed, then swallowed, willing his voice to remain calm. "They're charging the teacher for all 6 murders and putting him in Central." "Well," Martin's bushy white eyebrows raised in the middle of his dark forehead. "That's great. That's got to give you some peace." Robert stayed silent. "What?" His partner hunched forward. "What are you thinking?" "Something's wrong." Robert shook his head. "It's too easy. Scott Harden escapes, makes it all the way back home without this guy catching him, and he knows the killer? BH's other victims didn't attend Beverly High, so why break routine? Why take a kid who can ID him? It's too risky." "You're looking for reason and forgetting that the BH killer is a human. An unstable human. Don't look at it through a prosecutor's lens." "I have to. I'm pointing out the same things they will." "Robert," Martin warned him, "there's not enough to go on. It's the word of a teenage kid and a box that could have been planted. come on." Martin's voice was calm and comforting, and there was a reason he was one of the most successful attorneys in California. He could manipulate a jury's entire mood with just the lilt of his voice. "You've got a victim's eyewitness and evidence. He's it. We'll make sure he pays for what he did." "I'm worried it's not him." Robert leaned back and crossed his arms, steeling himself for his partner's response to his next words. He had been up all night thinking over Randall Thompson's arrest and the evidence against him. The man would need an attorney, and the public defenders would be playing hot potato to avoid the representation. Martin had always given him a fair amount of leniency in things that involved Gabe, but what he was about to say wouldn't go over well. "I want to represent him." Martin stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. "Is that a joke?" "As I said, I don't think it's him." "No, you said you're worried it's not him." "Fine." He sighed and amended his statement. "I don't think it's him." His partner in the firm moved closer to the desk and rested his elbows on the surface, pinning him with laser eye contact. "This is Gabe's killer we're talking about. Your son was like my own. I'd be more in support of you saying you want to deliver justice via a prison shank. You don't think isn't good enough, Rob. You want this to go to trial without cutting off this asshole's balls? Then fine. But sitting on his side of the defense table?" He studied him. "If you were anyone else, I'd think you were trying to sabotage his case, but you're too ethical for that. I don't have an ulterior motive here. I don't think he's the guy, which means the police have stopped looking for the real guy." Robert shrugged and hoped it came off as believable. "I've thought it through, Martin. I'm reaching out to the courts this afternoon to set up a meeting." Martin let out a sigh. "You're a grown man, Rob. You know the case better than anyone. But this feels rotten. I don't know what to tell you." "You don't have to tell me anything. I'm not asking permission." Robert balled up the napkin and tossed it into a round wastebasket beside Martin's desk. He needed to end this meeting before the questions began. Martin would nail him with brilliant, precise, and unavoidable inquiries that Robert wouldn't have answers for because it made no logical sense for him to come within 1,000 feet of the Randall Thompson case, not unless he was standing opposite him in the courtroom. "Okay, but one last thing that has to be said. This is a huge conflict of interest." Martin stood and walked around the desk, his arms crossing over his wide chest and pinning the front of his blood-red tie into place. "You lose this case, and he'll sue us. Say that you intentionally botched it. He'll say you destroyed evidence and led witnesses and didn't properly represent him. I'm not going to lose." Martin let out a frustrated laugh. "What am I missing here? You think he's innocent? Fine. Let the police and public defender handle that. There's nothing good that will come from your involvement. I need to meet with him. See what he says. Being his potential attorney gives me face time that I wouldn't otherwise have." He squeezed the man's thick shoulder. "If I don't believe what he says, I'll walk. You know I'll walk." Martin shook his head. "He's not going to want you as his attorney. I can't imagine he wants to discuss his activities with the father of one of the boys he killed." Robert said nothing. He'd spent the evening digging for everything he could find on Randall Thompson. The man worked as a high school science teacher, drove a 5-year-old Honda Accord, and lived in a 2-bedroom teardown. He couldn't afford to pass up free legal representation from the top criminal defense attorney in Los Angeles, no matter who that attorney's son was. Had been. Robert released Martin's shoulder and headed for the door, pausing when his partner spoke. "The press is going to crucify you for this. I know you think he might be innocent, but what if he's not? What if he killed Gabe and all those other boys?" Robert glanced back over his shoulder and pulled the door open, wishing he could tell the man everything. "Just trust me." The big man winced. That's the problem. I don't. Chapter 10. I stood at the dining room table and studied a puzzle piece and the box, trying to find a match between the two. Clementine wove between my legs, her tail tickling the backs of my bare knees. I twitched away. Clem, stop. She leaped onto the closest chair and mewed for attention. Setting the box on the table, I petted her head and stared down at the board. Today was not a good day. My 2:00 appointment had gone completely silent on me, which might have been a pleasant change of pace if I wasn't already paranoid about my skills as a shrink. I never used to worry about this. I'd always been a little overly cocky, convinced that I could wave my pen, open my mouth, and spew out a brilliant dialogue that could twist my clients' brains into performing however I wanted them to. But ever since John and Brooke had died, I had sunk further and further into the belief that my emotional radar was temporarily, or maybe even permanently, on the fritz. Take my last meeting with John. He'd been furious at Brooke. I remember sitting across from him and feeling the spittle hit my cheek as he had ranted about the man he thought she was seeing. I hadn't believed it, but my job wasn't to judge his wife's innocence, only to filter and analyze his thinking. The majority of trust issues were rooted in real-life experience, originating as far back as childhood. John had continually balked at discussions of his adolescence, which only gave further credence to his trust issues as a natural defense mechanism. If my psychological tuning fork had been in proper pitch, I would have ignored efforts to diagnose the root of his insecurities and instead focused on the more glaring possibility that his anger would cycle out of control and into physical violence. From my television in the living room, a game show came on. I glanced over and watched the host bound toward the stage, high-fiving the audience as he went. I've always held an ugly hypothesis about marriage, that at some point, one spouse secretly wishes the other would die. It's not a popular theory. When I broach it at psychology events and forums, it always sparks an argument. Some doctors jumping into denial with gasps and sputters and an insistence that they've been married 40 years and never once wished death on their spouse. But deep inside, in the dark place that they squash down and pretend doesn't exist, I know there's always been a true and weak moment where the thought, the hope, flickers. For most people, it's fleeting. For some, like John, it was a splinter, a deep splinter that broke off under the skin, the sort that was almost impossible to remove unless you peeled back the entire area, and no one would do that. So it festered. It grew infected. It killed and ate away at surrounding healthy tissue and throbbed and ached and dominated every thought and action until it controlled an entire life. I had listened to so much deliberation and thoughts about hurting Brooke that it had become background noise. I'd become desensitized to it. I'd accepted the fact that John fantasized over killing Brooke and had stopped being aghast at the idea because I didn't believe it would ever happen. They'd been married 15 years. If he was really going to kill the woman, he would have done it already. So what if he thought Brooke was having an affair? He'd been almost as irate a year earlier when she'd parked on a hill and hadn't fully engaged the emergency brake and the sedan had rolled into a parked car. This wasn't my fault. I pushed a 5-sided piece into place and mentally chanted the words, trying to find truth in them. This wasn't my fault. I'd argued with him in Brooke's defense, stood up for the woman, pointed out all their history and his false insecurities. This wasn't my fault. Maybe she really did have a heart attack. I lifted my wine glass and took a deep sip, holding the smooth Merlot on my tongue for a moment, then let it seep down my throat. The doorbell rang, a sharp ding-dong of intrusion, and I turned at the sound as Clementine sprinted past me and hid under the couch. Robert Kavin stood on my front stoop, a bouquet of flowers in hand. I paused in the foyer and hesitated. It was late, almost 9. Too late for a pop-in, though I had a staunch policy against them at any hour. I could just ease back around the corner and into the dark hall, stay away from the windows in the hope he would lose interest and head home. "Gwen," he placed his hand on the door, "I can see you through the glass." Of course he could. I had hoped the dim interior light would hide me, but luck hadn't been kind to me lately. Swallowing a curse, I flipped open the deadbolt. "Hi, Robert," I said crisply, as coldly as I could, considering the fact that he held out a bouquet of pink tulips, his face contrite and apologetic. It had been years since I'd gotten flowers. I took them from him and struggled not to bury my face in them and inhale their scent. "I know it's late, but I needed to apologize." With the flowers in hand, I had limited ability to bar the door, so I settled for my stoniest tone. "Go ahead." "I shouldn't have looked at the file. Shouldn't have gone in your office. Honestly, I shouldn't have even fixed breakfast without you. I'm sorry." I digested the apology and found that it tasted sincere. A stronger woman would have argued some key points, dressed him up and down for his actions, then ripped the heads off his flowers and thrown them back into his face. But it was chilly outside. My sleep shorts weren't warm enough to combat the open door, and it was hard to be cruel to anyone who had suffered the loss of a child. "Okay," I said agreeably. "Thanks for the flowers." He looked surprised at the easy acceptance, then slowly nodded, stepping back from the door. "Sure. I really am sorry." "Yeah." I studied him in the porch light. He was in a suit, this one without the third piece, his tie undone and hanging around his neck, the top button of his shirt unfastened. He looked like he needed food and sleep, and I could help with one of the two. I stepped back and held open the door. "Want to come inside? I've got lasagna I can heat up if you're hungry." He smiled sheepishly, and it was criminal how good the expression looked on his handsome features. "Sure," he said slowly, "if you're up for the company." Robert ate 3 huge squares of lasagna, then attacked the ongoing puzzle. I sat cross-legged on a padded dining room table chair and watched his hands move across the board like a Mensa kid in front of a Rubik's Cube. "Plus there's travel." He clipped a dark piece into the border trim. "I don't want to worry about them in a crate at a kennel." He was naming the reasons he didn't have a pet, which were all valid, if you were considering pets as sterile objects and completely discounted the joy they brought to your life. "How much do you travel?" I swirled the wine glass and watched the dark liquid sweep around the sides. "Not much," he admitted. "I went to Tahoe last summer. But, at some point I will." "Sure." I took a sip. A workaholic married to his job. From one addict to another, traveling isn't actually going to happen. You know that, right? He grimaced. I picked up a piece and studied the design. "I'm sorry about your son." In the days since Robert had left my house, I had researched him online. His impressive court record and legal accolades were buried on the 6th page of results behind the national news stories, press releases, and hundreds of videos and posts looking for leads and justice for Gabe Kavin. Half the news results were from the disappearance period. The other half were after they found his son's body behind a recycling plant in Burbank, a crude heart carved into his chest, his genitals tossed into the trash. The BH killer's signature marks, and his official 6th victim. He looked up from the puzzle and our eyes met. In the dim light of the bar, I hadn't seen the full extent of his sorrow. The drench of pain was haunting his eyes, pulling at his face, heavy in the sag of his posture. I'd treated a few parents after the loss of a child. The grief wouldn't go away. It would dilute in his eyes. He would grow better at masking it, disguising it, but it would always be there. Losing a child was like losing a limb. You were reminded of it every time you moved, until the consistent adjustments to life became a permanent part of you. His mouth pinched together in a flat line. Nothing to be sorry about. The apologies don't bring him back. No, they wouldn't. I changed the subject. I'm assuming you're being kept abreast of the arrest? Yep. He picked through the pile of homeless pieces. Are you familiar with the BH deaths? Killers were my obsession, and Los Angeles's most famous serial killer had been under my microscope from the beginning. I half rose from the chair and lifted the wine, pouring more in my glass. Without asking, I topped his off. It's in my wheelhouse, so yes, I've kept a professional interest in the killings. You said on the night we met that you do a lot of expert testimony. I do. Psychological profiles? At times. Where was he going with this? Done one on a serial killer before? Just in med school. He said nothing, and I waited out his thought process. Spotting a potential connection, I fit the puzzle piece in and locked it into place. I'd like to hire you. For what? A psychological profile on the BH killer, to start. With what I already knew about his kills, I could whip up a half-decent profile within a day. But half-decent probably wasn't what Robert Kavin was looking for. Why? My son died at his hands. His glare challenged me to question the request. Do I need another reason? No, I said slowly. But your son was found 9 months ago. Why wait until now for a psych profile? They have the killer. I didn't know you 9 months ago. I bought a few seconds by taking a slow sip of Merlot. It wasn't that I didn't want to do it. I was itching to push him out the door and sharpen my pencil. But something was off here, and I needed to put my finger on what it was. Do you have the case file on your son? He shouldn't. It'd be a horrible thing for him to possess. Yet something in his self-assured manner told me he did. He nodded. Ah, the psychological trauma that each autopsy photo, every casual case note had to cause. I tried not to outwardly wince. I have his, and I can get you the others soon, in the next few days. The others? I inhaled at the possibility of reviewing the full details of all 6 victims. How are you getting those? Just know I can get them. I frowned, skeptical. Right. If it was true, if I could look at all 6 of the BH victims and their circumstances, it'd be a psychologist's dream. And to make it all better, the killer was already behind bars. I could visit him, talk to him, do a proper psychoanalysis, assuming I could get authorization from his legal team. I realized I was staring at him. I straightened in the chair. Okay, I'll do it. I tried to keep the excitement out of my voice, but it still coated the words. The corners of his mouth lifted, but it wasn't a smile. It was disappointment, and I didn't have time to process it before he spoke. I'll bring you a copy of Gabe's file tomorrow. That would be great. I watched as he tossed a piece down without finding its place. I'm going to head home. Thanks for the food and the hospitality. I rose. Sure. And I appreciate the flowers. They're beautiful. 2 polite people circling a dead teenager. Thanks for not slamming the door in my face. He paused in the foyer, then leaned over and kissed me gently on the cheek. The stubble of his cheek brushed against my skin, and he smelled like the night we met, minus the cigarette smoke from the bar. Good. Really good. Night. He stepped away and moved through the door, tripping on the first step and catching himself. Careful. Good night. I held the door open until he was halfway down my stepping stones, heading toward a glistening black Mercedes parked in my drive. I pushed the door shut and flipped the lock, then reached up and engaged the deadbolt. Returning to the dining room, I collected our glasses and the empty wine bottle, then flipped off the light, leaving the rest of the puzzle for another night. Standing at the sink, I squirted lavender dish soap onto a fresh sponge and washed his plate. He was an interesting man. Very high emotional intelligence. He could read me as well as, or better than I could read him. Behind the charm, he hid his emotions well. My father would have said he played his cards flush against his chest, and he would have been right. He was a man with grief and history, but also there was something deeper there. I couldn't put my finger on it, and it was driving me crazy. Maybe it was just raw attraction. My body responded to his presence in unsettling ways, and I had struggled, when we parted, to not lean in for a kiss. I picked up a fluffy white dish towel and ran it around the surface of the red ceramic plate. I also had to face the possibility that my attraction to Robert Kavin had increased when I'd realized his connection to the BH killer. And now, with him hiring me for a psychological profile, my skin was practically humming with excitement. Careers were made from opportunities like this. If Randall Thompson was the killer, and all reports seemed to indicate he was, then these events would be studied by psychology professionals for decades. Motives, history, the transition of thought into action in cyclical fashion. Randall Thompson would be compared with Lonnie Franklin Jr. and Joseph James D'Angelo, and I would have an inside look at every single detail. For Robert to give me that access? Screw the flowers and the orgasms. This was huge, and as unbelievable as it seemed, all 6 case files? I believed his confidence when he said he could get them. That arrogance, the opportunity, the memories of our night together. Sheets twisting, mouths hot and frantic. All of it had Robert Kavin stuck in my mind. A fixation, and not an entirely healthy one. The man was grieving, damaged. Gabe Kavin had died, along with 5 other innocent boys. A monster was responsible, and I shouldn't be salivating at the thought of studying him. I opened the cabinet and stacked the plate on top of the others. 6 boys had died, and soon I would be given the keys to figuring out why. Chapter 11. The next day, I walked my 4:30 appointment to the lobby and paused at the sight of Robert Kavin. The tall attorney was standing at Jacob's desk, and I zeroed in on the thick file in his hand. I glanced back to my client, a peeping Tom with unresolved mother issues. "I'll see you next week, Jeff." Jeff Maven nodded, then beelined for the stairwell. "Dr. Moore?" Robert ambled toward me with the confidence of an alpha male. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course." I held the heavy office door open and nodded to Jacob. "Please hold my calls." Robert passed into my office, and I caught the faint whiff of an expensive cologne. Inside the office, he paused, surveying the room. "Nice digs. We got lucky with our lease. If we signed on today, we'd be paying triple net rent." I took a seat in one of the low-slung leather chairs beside the love seat. He noticed the breakfast bar in the corner of the room. "Mind if I get a cup of coffee?" He set the file folder on my desk. "Not at all. In fact," I leaned over and plucked my almost empty mug off the side table. "Can you top me off?" "Sure." He reached for the cup, and his fingers brushed mine. Our eyes met, and I let go of the ceramic handle. He turned away and stopped in front of the coffee pot. "You're a doctor, so I'm assuming our conversations are protected by doctor-patient confidentiality?" An interesting question. You're hiring me, so yes. But, as I'm sure you're well aware, that confidentiality is limited. Oh yes, I'm aware. He turned toward me, 2 cups in hand. If a patient is in imminent danger to himself or others, you're obligated to tell the authorities. Right? It was interesting the way he delivered questions, as if everyone was accusatory. A byproduct of thousands of hours on the stand or, and just as likely, a deep-rooted inclination to suspect the worst in people. I skipped the urge to point out the psychological tick and nodded. Yes, if a patient is likely to cause himself or someone else harm, we're required to report it. I have a feeling, given your clients, that you've bent that rule before. He settled into the seat in front of me and lifted his cup to his lips. Where was he going with this? I crossed my legs, but his gaze stayed on my face. Impressive focus, especially given the length of this skirt. It was one I rarely wore, and one that tiptoed on the edge of unprofessional, but it was a good card to pull out when I needed to test a man. Robert Kavin had passed. I ignored the comment and glanced at the file he'd placed on my desk. It was fat and red and had a rubber band around its midsection, pinning it closed. What's with the confidentiality question? I placed my notebook down on the table between us and relaxed in the seat, hoping the new body language would ease the tension from his shoulders. It didn't. If anything, his brow furrow deepened. Just wondering if you're trustworthy. I picked up the cup of coffee Robert had set before me. It's a necessity in my line of work. If clients couldn't trust me, they wouldn't talk about their problems. They confess things they've done? I made a face, annoyed with the question, one I received frequently. Their actions come out sometimes when we talk about guilt. I cupped my hands around the mug, comforted by the warmth of the ceramic. Each client is different. For some, it's healing to talk. His jaw tightened, and I studied him closely, trying to read between his questions. Some evasiveness was to be expected in his line of work, but there was more than just curiosity in his tone, and more than distrust. There was also a tight edge of anger. That was interesting. I poked the emotion. Why all the questions? In response, he gestured to the folder. That's Gabe's file. Let me know if you have any questions. He straightened the line of his tie, but didn't meet my eyes. With another client, I'd consider it a deceptive tell, but this I read as pain. This was important to him. Important enough for him to drive through rush hour traffic and be here in person, a stiff, new copy of Gabe's file in hand. I rose and went to it. Pulling the rubber band free, I opened the folder and ran my finger along the row of color-coded tabs that organized the contents. How many psychologists have you given this to? Shrinks? None. We don't really like that term, I said mildly, flipping open the tab marked Evidence. There was a neat line of items, and my blood hummed with excitement. Sorry. There are better ways to heal than obsessing over the killer. I was dying to study the file, to read each page in detail, to find the hidden clues. I always loved clues, which was why I set down the file and turned my attention back to Robert. He was giving me clues. I just couldn't seem to follow them. Healing isn't my main objective. Maybe it should be. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, this week's arrest of your son's killer is a major emotional event. Don't psychoanalyze me. Just read his file and tell me what you think. I let out a half laugh. Psychoanalyzing people is part of my job. His gaze hardened. Not this job. For a proper profile, I'd need more than just his file. I settled back onto the couch, ignoring the silent scream of the folder. You said you could get all the other victim files? Yes, but Look at his first and see if you have the stomach for it. I glanced at my watch, conscious of the fact that I had another appointment in 15 minutes. My stomach won't be a problem, but my time is tight. I'll need a few days to go through everything. Well, you told me the night we met that you specialize in clients with violent inclinations. That's right. His knee jiggled, a quick, staccato beat that stilled when I looked at it. It was a tell, and I catalogued it beside the evasive eye contact and the bite of hostility in his tone. Frustration? Angst? He leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees, delivering the direct eye contact I wanted. It was invasive, a cross-examination level of confrontation, and I welcomed it. Why spend your days with society's most vile individuals? I don't see them as vile, I answered truthfully. I see them as human. We all battle demons. If they're in my office, it's because they're trying to fix that part of them. I can relate to that. Can you? I arched a brow at him in question. He held my stare for a long moment, then rose, buttoning his suit jacket closed with a finality that came from years of practice. I don't need you to analyze me. Just read Gabe's file and send me your initial thoughts, Gwen. You know, I think I'll pass. I stayed in place. You can take the file with you. It was a bitchy move and a gamble, given that I wanted the job as badly as anything in recent memory. Still, the risk was necessary. I had to see how much he really needed me, because there were a lot of experts out there, but he was in my office, the file on my desk. Why? He paused, and when he turned to face me, the frustration was evident. I'm hiring you for a job. You're refusing the work? There's a potential conflict of interest. And that... He cleared his throat and began again. That is what? We slept together, I pointed out. I'm not exactly an unbiased third party. You may put too much weight into my opinion, or it may be skewed on my end, based on our history. It was a valid and excellent point, one my conscience had raised as soon as I started to get excited about the potential project. It was one night, he shrugged. Not exactly history. My ego wilted a little, and I smiled to hide the hurt. You're also grieving. So? The death of a loved one can eat at you, I said quietly. Looking at crime scene photos? Obsessing over his murderer? I just want to make sure it doesn't devour you. A sardonic smile twisted across his lips. Too late for that. He strode forward and picked up the file. But if you don't want to do it, don't. I'll find another expert. The country's full of them. He waited, and there was a long moment where we played a silent game of reverse psychology. And I lost. I held out my hand. Give me a few days and any of the other case files you can get. He handed it over, and then, like a lion sauntering away from a carcass, he strolled out of the room. I looked down at the folder, then glanced again at my watch. 8 minutes before my next appointment. Just enough time for a peek. Chapter 12. Los Angeles welcomed Scott back with open arms, and everyone wanted a piece. With Nita beside him, Scott appeared on the local news, then sat down with People magazine. His mother followed him through hair and makeup, sound checks, and on-camera interviews. With each performance, Scott's story grew smoother, and his confidence bloomed. Then the camera would turn off, and he'd retreat back to his bedroom, to his phone, uninterested in life. Now, Nita sat in a green room, watching him on a bank of monitors, a cold diet soda in hand. Beside her, a production assistant with a diamond nose ring and a goofy headset loudly gushed over Scott. Your son is a hero, she mused. To escape like that, and to be brave enough to tell his story? Yes, he is. Nita watched her son on screen, his dimple appearing as he turned his head to face the co-host. What Scott had done was so brave. Then again, Scott had always been brave. When he was 6 and there had been a giant snake in their yard, he had grabbed its tail and yanked without even thinking twice. The camera cut to the interviewer's face. "I know it's painful to recount, but can you tell our viewers how you escaped?" Scott looked down, as he always did when faced with a difficult question. The camera scanned across a crowd filled with concerned audience members paying rapt attention. Nita thought of the first time she'd heard his answer in their large dining room, the silver still out on the buffet, where the housekeeper had been polishing it. The room had been dim, the curtains pulled tight, covering the impressive views of the gardens. Once it had been her dream home. Now it would always be the place where she had lost and then refound her son. "He used to chain me up," Scott rubbed at the underside of his wrist, as if remembering the restraints. "By my wrists and ankles." Nita had heard the story a dozen times, but forced herself to stay in place. If he could live through it, she could listen to it. Naked. That was how the monster tied up her son. It was a fact Scott left out of the media interviews, and she felt guilty for appreciating the omission. The sexual torture the BH victims had experienced was something the police had kept out of the news. In awareness of that, and of the other victims' families, they had made a decision, among their family and with the police, to keep the information private. "I had hidden a fork he had given me to eat dinner with. Normally he watched me eat, but this time he didn't. He had a phone call or a meeting, something." Scott always faltered a little bit on this part of the story.